So to introduce everyone, you are here for a webinar called Increase Resiliency for Your SaaS-Based Data. And I am Adam Scamihorn, the product director for cloud at InterVision. While I've been here over the last decade, I've worn a lot of hats around business continuity, resiliency, and security. And so business risk is something I'm always interested in helping organizations explore. And joining me from Keepit is Niels van Ingen. Niels, can you go ahead and introduce yourself for everyone?
Sure. Hey, Adam, thanks for that. Hi, everybody. My name is Niels van Ingen, based here in beautiful Colorado. Been Senior Vice President on Business Development and Strategy, but also very involved on the product side. Been in the backup recovery archiving space for the last 20 years. Been with Keepit 5 years before that with Veritas Semantic and some startups that joined, that got acquired. So been in the space a long time and plenty of innovation to talk about.
Excellent. Thank you, Niels. So to kind of kick us off, with so many organizations accelerating their cloud adoption, particularly into software as a service like Microsoft 365, Google Workspaces, and Salesforce, what are some common challenges you're seeing in the market when it comes to ensuring comprehensive backup solutions?
It's probably actually making sure that customers have an idea as to what they need to do when it comes to protection of SaaS application. So if you look at it from a market perspective, both innovation but also SaaS adoption as a result of that is happening very, very quickly. So on the average, customers have around 50 SaaS apps that are actually okayed by IT, but a lot of times there are many, many more, and this continues. So Gartner expects 75% of enterprise apps are going to be delivered via SaaS. Now, customers have adopted this to, increase speed, increase functionality, to ultimately allow them to achieve business goals. But what often gets overlooked from that transition from on-prem to new applications is they really need to make sure that they understand what they are responsible for when it comes to data protection. So, the cloud vendors deliver the app, they deliver the environment to make sure everything stays up and running. And in general, they do a really, really good job around that. But when it comes to the data itself, that's ultimately a responsibility that lies with the customers. And most customers it's still an education today that a lot of customers are not necessarily aware and understand what their risk profile is, adopting all these solutions, and then, what happens if things go bad.
So expand on that for me a little bit more about the risks associated in SaaS application. When we're looking at organizations looking at efficiencies in services like cloud services, and they're relying on them specifically for the backup and data storage, what are the risks that they're looking at?
Well, the key risk, so in general, what they're struggling with, and again, it comes back to they're so easy to adopt, and generally they lack control around it, and also they lack visibility. So rather than IT sort of, and it's more and more the security teams around this as well, sort of guiding the organization, this is approved, this is not. A lot of things to get adopted very, very quickly. And then again, it goes straight to productivity rather than thinking if things go bad, what am I responsible? How do I recover from this? And we see more and more of these cases. Now, obviously, the applications a lot of times would come with certain capabilities. So if you think about, for example, Microsoft 365, you have things like the recovery bin. So if you delete something from Exchange, from a mailbox, or you delete something out SharePoint, you have a certain amount of time to get that data back. But that does not equal backup. If you have bigger things go wrong, and obviously, for many years now we've been dealing with ransomware, then obviously it can really impact a customer in a really significant way. And it's not just about ransomware. Another key item that customers need to think about is sort of the insider threats. So somebody leaves the company, they're not happy with how things went, and they decide, for example, to sabotage the environment. When it comes to SaaS, and this is sort of, again, still the education that's happening, is again, a lot of customers assume the vendors are taking care of this, yet it's their responsibility. So there's a mismatch there. The second part comes very much, well, if I need to recover, how does that work? So if you think about in the context of disaster recovery, how do I continue my business? How do I make sure the important functions come back first? So, ultimately, I can get paid, my customers are getting the service, all those types of things. And generally, most customers do not have a plan for this. one key question I often ask customers, dealing with SaaS applications, sort of, the protection profile around this is, how much ransom are you willing to pay? And a lot of times it's a shocking sort of question for customers because they've not really thought that through. But if you have not thought through your data protection for SaaS application, then it's not if, it's when you're going to be in that situation. And so you have to think in those terms to make sure that only from a business perspective, you're prepared.
Absolutely. We've been working in the data protection and security response space for the last decade plus, and over the last 4 years, I know we've seen significant rise in ebbs and flows of ransomware versus business email compromise. I think I know I read Microsoft now says that 75% of organizations' intellectual property and data is in their actual email. And so the need to protect that data, I think, is pretty key. You talked a
Yeah,
little bit about. Go ahead.
yeah, and
Don't
it's
let me cut you
definitely,
off.
we talked about email for a long, long time. That's ultimately
Yeah.
where I came from 20 years ago is when this all started with the big banking crisis and that was happening at the time. Uh, but it's obviously expanded beyond email, right? If you now look at all the information shared, for example, in Teams,
Yeah.
how SharePoint is being used, the consolidation of information that used to be on-prem now moved to the cloud, all that information ultimately ends up somewhere, and most customers actually don't understand necessarily what they have. And there's two parts to this also from a SaaS perspective that's important. That one is actually the data itself, and at times you can sort of argue, well, is it important? But again, it will get more important as it's not just about data protection, it also becomes more and more about information governance. But the other key piece is, okay, what is controlling this data? So if I think about this ransomware, or I think, for example, about insider threats, a lot of people, certainly people thinking about, hey, I need to protect Microsoft 365. But a lot of people don't necessarily then also think about, but I also need to protect Intra-ID, where if you go back 10, 15 years ago, everybody understood that you needed to protect your Exchange server and you need to protect your Active Directory. Well, the challenge is still very much the same.
Hmm.
And the solution also should very much still be the same. So from a Keepit perspective, one thing we truly believe in is actually still it used to be the 3-2-1, now we think it's 4-3-2-1 sort of principle where you have to have multiple copies separated from your production environment in different formats, and it needs to be immutable. And with the world getting unsafer by the day, that is more, that's as important as it's ever before.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up 3-2-1 and kind of your evolution on that. When businesses and organizations are looking at being successful at protecting their data in the cloud, what are key things that you think they need to be looking at and measuring internally? One of the things we talk about at InterVision a lot is you got to measure what matters. And
Yeah.
if you're just building KPIs that are something you're going to succeed at, it's probably not going to be real useful. But what are the key things from your perspective that organizations need to look at to make sure that data is safe?
So I think that when it comes to SaaS, and again, I also came from the on-prem world and spent my life around all kinds of workloads and server load and all these types of things. And RTO in the on-prem world was clearly understood, and based on the amount of money spent, you could almost get to any kind of RTO that you desired as technology evolved. On the cloud side is different because on the cloud side, everything is an object, everything has to go through public APIs. And so it's not just how fast can I fill or it's much more how do I get access to the data and then make smart decisions on what I need to restore. And so tied to that, this is really the first step before you actually get to RTO conversation is customer, what do I need to have up and running from a SaaS application perspective to make sure I can conduct business, right? And it could be, hey, it could be things like Microsoft Data. There's a lot of applications, for example, that depend on stuff first. And what I'm seeing goes from SMB to this world, it's very much that most customers are still not having their arms around, a disaster recovery approach and really understand what they need to do if bad things happen, which at this point you should assume. And this is also why it's very much part of the security posture, right? If you look at a security framework, the piece that's actually underfunded the most in that, even though there's been obviously a tremendous amount of spend in the security space, is actually around recovery. So everybody's trying to out, keep going, but if you get breached, what are you going to do about it? And again, there needs to be a lot more effort put into understanding what you need to do in what order, who needs to be involved to ultimately make sure that you can continue as a business as fast as possible.
Well said, Niels. Um, you talked a little bit about, what that recovery looks like in RTO and RPO. A lot of times when organizations are really looking at measuring those things, they're also looking at specific compliance and regulatory categories they need to meet. What do you see for the future when it comes to cloud and SaaS-based protections in the regulatory and compliance side of things?
So yeah, it's a great question, and for me, it's a really interesting one because I came from both the backwards side, but also the archive compliance e-discovery space. And for me, it's like Groundhog Day. We solved a lot of these issues, 10, 15 years ago around e-discovery and compliance. How do you manage, from a healthcare perspective around HIPAA, but also financial with dealer broker, all that kind of stuff. And then we went to cloud and we kind of forgot everything and we started all over again and then just expanded the palette, if you will, with Teams, with all these applications that don't just come online individually, but they're all interconnected. And so I think certainly from a regulatory perspective, and also with the introduction of AI, you're going to see more and more legislation to say you need to understand to control your data. Because ultimately it has a society, a business, and personal of a personal impact on people's life. And so thinking about how you manage data, becomes more and more important. And so you're going to see from, we're talking about data protection day to data protection and information governance to, making sure that ultimately you do proper data management, across all these different applications and all this different data that you ultimately collect and create. And that's ahead of us. That's a big task for companies to come to grips with, because when you look at these types of issues, there's no magic button. There's not just some piece of technology that solves this, right? Most of these problems are always, it starts with people, then you need to have the right process, and then you need to have technology to enforce it. And it's always in that order. And again, AI is going to help with that, but it's not going to solve all of that. Probably
So,
contribute to part of the problems as well.
yeah, just buying one tool or trying to put one person in place doesn't solve it. The people, process, and technology, I'd 100% agree.
Yeah, and I think the one tool that's also sort of an interesting thing to call out, because I came from a place where there were vendors solving many, many problems and actually doing that really well, portfolio vendors. If you look
Mhm.
at the world today, you look at the rate of innovation and the rate of adoption, you see this very much in the security landscape. We have 23,000 different security vendors, something like that. As
Yeah.
vendors, we have to really think about like much more about fabrics and meshes and how we work together to actually solve customer jobs. Because there's not one solution that's going to solve all of this. And so the interoperability and working together becomes much more important, ultimately to ensure again we can do the jobs that customers require us to do for them.
Yeah. So let's pivot a little bit. You know, we see a lot of times the organizations don't spend really heavily into the security and recovery of their organization until they've had to learn a hard lesson.
Yes.
Whereas we'd much rather help organizations learn from others' mistakes so they don't have to experience the bad. And one of the ways we do that is we like to share kind of horror stories or, lessons from the field. Are there any examples you can think of without sharing names or details that would be sensitive about customers who faced unexpected challenges with protecting their workloads and maybe some outcomes and lessons learned in the SaaS space?
Yeah, so there's plenty of examples. So again, if you talk
Sure.
to it was sort of taboo to talk about this. We see it more and more because I think everybody's facing similar challenges. But this happens to customers all the time. Like if you think about sort of the stats, 75%, has incurred or has been involved in attacks, sometimes successful, sometimes not. But it happens every day, all day long. And again, the threats are come from different places. It's not just about data encryption. It's also about data leakage. So people getting in, sort of siphoning off data for a long, long time and then hold you ransom for that. Another key piece, it's actually less about malware nowadays and viruses than actually using credentials to get to the key pieces of data. And again, a key reason why you want to have this separate from your production environment. So if you have your production in Microsoft, why would you stay in Microsoft? We've seen plenty of examples lately where having all your eggs in one basket doesn't make a lot of sense. From a pure example perspective, we see and hear stuff every day working with our customers, right? And it ranges from, again, a ticked off employee that basically wiped out Entra ID because he was not happy with how things went and making sure there was no way to recover from that. So if you lose Entra ID, you kind of lose your cloud environment as a whole.
Right.
To, data being stolen, data being encrypted, and that leads to things like, for example, there's this massive shipping company where the environment was impacted, and all of a sudden, they couldn't really send the ships to the right ports, which then impacted stores and everything else, right? So it ranges pretty far. Another one that's well known is obviously around the healthcare space a couple months ago, where things went wrong, and as a result, the hospitals and doctors were not able to get paid. The downside impact of that was not just from a hospital and patient perspective, so we all got impacted by that, but actually it turns out to be where the government now needed to support small businesses via loans to make sure they stay in business, because obviously they have a function to fulfill. To big manufacturing companies that makes various things that you probably have on yourself, where the production environment was impacted, and as a result, plants went down for 2 weeks, right? This is happening every day, all day long. And again, the key to understand is that it's not necessarily about the viruses anymore. It's much more about, again, internal getting access to control systems. So, for example, when we talk about Microsoft 365, that obviously is a key focus, but you have to tie what controls that, which is Entra ID, right? So you have to protect the whole rather than just part of it, just like we used to do in the old days on-prem.
Yeah, well said. And I think part of that broader solution is where InterVision's been really excited to partner with Keepit. We have our ransomware protection as a service suite where we can provide security services, governance services, and recovery services all underneath one bundle. From your perspective in working with managed service providers, what do you see are good advantages your clients are getting from outsourcing their data protection to managed service providers like InterVision?
Well, the key benefit is that ultimately it gets done, right? So I spend a lot of times with MSPs, but also with customers in all segments. And the scary part to me still is that whether it's SMB, commercial, or enterprise, large enterprise, most customers are not necessarily ready. And then you can sort of ask the question, well, why is that? Well, one, I think if you look at it from an expertise perspective, there's been a drain dump, like how many people really understand the space. But the other key piece that I mentioned earlier is that the rate of innovation, rate of adoption is so quick that it's really hard to be an expert in everything. And I think the key value that MSPs deliver is, one, they take a platform approach, meaning this is what they're really good at, and they have an ability to actually combine all the experiences and build the services around such to make sure and basically take that burden away from customers. So they are the trusted advisor, the expert, to ultimately make sure that the customer can focus on accelerating the business, focus on the business outcome. As an individual customer, almost any size, that is becoming more and more difficult. And again, with the introduction of Gen AI, the adoption of more and more cloud apps, that's not going to get any easier. So, get the expert help, because again, it's the cheapest way you can do this for the best level of protection that you can get.
Well said. So as we get to the end of our conversation here, what is one thing, one final thought, all of the things that we talked about very quickly in the last 20 minutes, that if our attendees left with only one final thought, what would you want them to remember about our conversation?
A lot of times these things turn into a technology thing, right? It's a backup thing, or it's all the key thing to remember is you need to look at your business. And you need to really think through, if I adopt these types of technology or these types of new processes, what does it mean to my business if I would lose them? And figure that out. Because once you figure that out, the next steps, for example, working with InterVision or working with Keepit or working with any vendor, are become pretty clear. So I think it's very much sort of taking stock, slow down, understand what you need to do from a business perspective to make sure you stay in business, and then actually turn to what are then the things you need to do to actually address this now and in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Niels. So with that said, I'm going to open it up to questions. And if you've got questions, feel free to drop them into the chat or the Q&A. And um, Amanda will help kind of put those forward to us as we wait for your questions. So one thing that just popped in um, was if an organization has no compliance requirements, so if I don't have any need to have retention and recovery, are not the default backup options from cloud providers good enough?
Well, maybe not, right? It comes back to one, you need to look at your business and what data do you need to retain? Because, most data, most companies actually, they over retain. They have a hard time actually getting rid of stuff. If you look at it from a vendor perspective, from a vendor perspective, it can be very clear on what you need to solve for. Coming back to my earlier statement, right? Approach is not from a technology perspective, start with the business need. And again, um, sometimes it's, you need to find the people responsible in your organization, somebody making a decision on that. Two, obviously, it sort of implies that you really understand what the vendor really delivers. And so one good example right now is that Microsoft announced the Microsoft backup for M365, so their own service. If you talk to a Gartner analyst, they will tell you actually that's not backup, it's just taking a snapshot, which
Right.
is not the same as backup. So again, can you afford one from a cost perspective, because that thing is, again, it just increases over time. And we've seen this on SharePoint too, it just gets more and more expensive because it just eats and never gets rid of anything. But can you afford that? And can you also afford, if bad things happen, to not have the data available that maybe your business relies on? So I think retention, both in the context of security protection, but also information governance long term, is something to really look at. And again, making sure that the data is retained for the right amount of time. The other thing that I would add to that is that, again, we're not living in sort of a one application world anymore, right? So again, within the Microsoft ecosystem, you see a lot of customers use, for example, Power BI to support business processes. It's not necessarily about the data, but what happens to your business outcomes if you, for example, use the configuration of these business flows, if you will. So there's more things to consider here than just it's a, I can accomplish with I can accomplish the required needs with my vendor. You need to make sure you can, and then take appropriate action. The core of it for all these applications is still the same. Like, you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. If you
Mhm.
have all of your production in Microsoft, in Salesforce, in Google, in AWS, then again, there's a question: should you have that all in one place? Because if that gets compromised, where do you go?
100%. Seeing another question pop in here about cyber insurance. Are you seeing any kind of requirements coming from the cyber insurance industry on protecting SaaS-based data in order to
Absolutely.
either have insurance or to discount that insurance?
Absolutely,
Mhm.
right. So and it's actually, cyber insurance has taken has been on an interesting journey for the last 2 years, and certainly with CIOs, we're having this discussion quite often, and it's changing rapidly, right? Because one, the number of incidents is going up. Like, so I live in Colorado, you can kind of compare it to wildfire. It's getting harder and harder to get insurance. The same is true on the cyber insurance side. So one, the rates are going up, so to the point where maybe they're not affordable. Two, if you can show that you're taking the appropriate steps and that you recover, then obviously, you're eligible and you probably get a premium that you can afford. The other thing to think about is, once you have it, and this is also something to keep in mind, because this didn't used to be true, but it's definitely more and more true today, is that once you have it, companies, cyber insurance providers actually expect you to keep it up with it. So they do more and more testing themselves to make sure, one, do you have the right policies, what is your true state of readiness, and sort of monitor that over time. If you do it well as a company, then obviously you get more favorable rates. If you don't do it, then most of the time you cannot even get it.
Well said. While we wait to see if there's anyone else who has a question, I am curious to ask kind of as a follow-on to that last one. You mentioned testing. What are you seeing as kind of the best way to test recovery from SaaS backups into things like Google Workspaces or Salesforce?
Yeah, so the key is, again, one, be very clear on what you need to accomplish in case of disaster, right? Because most of the time it's not all or nothing.
Right.
So you have a whole bunch of occasions where, hey, it's an individual, for example, in Salesforce, we need to make sure we can recover all the opportunities, for example, and put that back because we had some kind of corruption happening, those types of things. Or it's, hey, we need to populate a sandbox. Um, or hey, this user, can't find their item. They have a presentation in a half an hour. Pull it back from the system. So those are sort of the individual use cases, and people lose data. It happens all the time. The bigger one on the if you think about big events like ransomware, again, most of the time it's not everything is gone. It's parts that are gone, and then there's two pieces to think about. One, again, very much the control plane. So Entra ID, for example,
Hmm.
or Okta, those types of things, and then the data itself. And so go through, create the scenarios, and from time to time, make sure you test those scenarios to make sure you can get up and running in the way you need to. Now, with cloud, what's really, really important again to consider is not just about restoring. Often the first step is actually how to get access to the data. And so, for example, one of the unique features we have as Keepit is without restoring, you can actually get access to the data, give access to the right people to get things going, and then actually start a recovery process. But again, it should all be planned. It should be thought through. And as vendors, and certainly as Keepit, one of the key things we pride ourselves is this idea of guided recovery. But again, it's very much working with the customer to make sure that the right things happen at the right time.
Perfect. Well, I don't see any other questions rolling in. So at this point in time, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in and kind of exploring this topic and the importance of protecting SaaS data with us. And Niels, I'd just like to say thank you to you for joining me as part of this conversation. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, Adam. Thank you.
Thanks all.